I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened to me on the morning of August 3rd, 2004. I need you to understand that I am not a man who invents things. I am not a man who seeks attention, who fabricates stories for sympathy, or who has ever in his life wanted to be known for anything other than quiet competence and honest work. I was a search and rescue volunteer with the Chelan County team in Washington State for 11 years. I was trained to observe accurately under extreme stress. I was trained to remain functional when everything around me was chaos. I was trained above all else to report only what I had actually seen and heard, never what I wished I had seen, never what fear or exhaustion suggested, only the empirical, documented, verifiable fact. I am telling you this because what I am about to share with you is the empirical, documented, verifiable fact of the most impossible morning of my life. At approximately 5:47 a.m. on August 3rd, 2004, in the upper Entiat River drainage in the Wenatchee National Forest, a Bigfoot stepped out of the tree line 12 feet in front of me, looked directly into my eyes, and said, in English, so clear and precise it sounded like a man reading from a prepared statement, "Please, I need your help. My child is dying. Please." And then it waited to see what I would do. What most people don't understand is that there was no build-up, no months of preliminary contact, no footprints left as calling cards, no gradual approach. This being came directly to a human being in a moment of desperate need and asked for help in the only language it calculated I would understand. It skipped all the caution and the distance and the careful management of contact that I have since learned is typical of its kind, because it had no time for any of that. Its child was dying, and I was there, and I was the only option it had. I have asked myself 10,000 times since that morning what I would have done if I had been a different kind of man. If I had run, if I had reached for the radio, if I had frozen in place and done nothing while it stood there with desperation carved into every line of its enormous face. I didn't run, I didn't freeze. I asked it, and my voice was steadier than I had any right to expect. Where? What happened over the next 6 hours changed my life in ways I am still, 20 years later, only partially able to account for. Some of what I witnessed was heartbreaking. Some of it was extraordinary beyond any word I have for extraordinary. And some of it, the consequences that followed, the things that happened to me and around me in the weeks and months after that morning, were shocking in ways that make the encounter itself seem almost calm by comparison. I am sharing this now because I am 58 years old and I have carried this alone long enough. Here's why this changed everything for me, and why the before matters as much as the after. In the summer of 2004, I was 3 years out of a divorce that had left me with a small cabin near Entiat, a truck with 180,000 miles on it, and a weekday job maintaining trails for the Forest Service. I was not unhappy. I want to be precise about this, because there is a narrative people reach for when a person describes a life-altering encounter in the wilderness. They assume the person was lost, searching, emotionally primed for revelation. I was not any of those things. I was quiet, functional, slightly lonely in the ordinary way of men in their late 30s, living alone in rural places, and I was at peace with the forest in the straightforward way that comes from spending most of your waking hours in it. I had no particular belief in Bigfoot. I had heard the stories, the way everyone in the Pacific Northwest has heard the stories. I had never given them serious thought. I was the kind of person who believed in what I could measure, touch, document. 39 years old, search and rescue trained, Forest Service employee, skeptic by disposition and habit. On August 3rd, 2004, I had set out before dawn to inspect a section of trail that had been reported damaged by a windstorm the previous week. The Antioch drainage at that elevation, roughly 4,200 feet, is dense mixed forest, heavy with Douglas fir and western larch. I knew that section of trail intimately. I had walked it dozens of times in all weathers. I had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. At 5:31 a.m., I noted in my field notebook that the forest was unusually quiet. I marked it as a weather observation. Sometimes a pressure change will suppress birdsong, and kept walking. I know now what that quiet meant. I did not know it then. At 5:47 a.m., I rounded a bend in the trail where it opened slightly around a rocky outcrop, and it was there, standing in the trail 12 feet ahead of me. I want to describe this carefully because every detail matters, and I have been careful with these details for 20 years. It was approximately 8.5 feet tall. The shoulders were massive. I am 5'11" and broad through the chest, and its shoulders were more than half again the width of mine. The hair was a dark reddish brown, the color of wet cedar bark, and it was matted and disheveled in a way that, with hindsight, I understand as the appearance of a being that had been moving urgently through dense brush for some time. The face was, and I have struggled with this description more than any other, recognizable. Not human, but recognizable in the way that a face with eyes set forward for depth perception, with brow and jaw and the musculature of expression, is recognizable as belonging to something that thinks. The eyes were what stopped my breathing, dark brown, almost black, large, and filled with something that every cell in my body recognized before my mind could name it. Desperation. Pure, unambiguous, parental desperation. My experience revealed something profound in that first second. The fear I should have felt did not come. What came instead was recognition. This creature was not threatening me. It was not posturing, not displaying aggression, not doing any of the things that every large animal does when surprised at close range. It was standing perfectly still, with its body angled slightly sideways, a non-confrontational posture I would learn much later, that is deliberate and practiced. And it was looking at me with the expression of a parent who has run out of all other options. It spoke before I had taken another breath. "Please, I need your help. My child is dying. Please." 4 sentences, each one measured, deliberate, chosen. No stumbling, no searching for words. This was not improvised language. This was a plea that had been formed, perhaps rehearsed, in the terrifying hours before it stepped onto that trail. The voice was deep beyond description, a resonance you felt in your ribs rather than heard with your ears. But the words were formed with a precision that made the depth irrelevant. Every consonant was exact. Every word was the right word. Whatever this being was, it had not accidentally acquired English. It had learned it with purpose, and now it was using it for the purpose it had learned it for. I stood very still. I let the word settle, and then I asked, "Where?" What most people don't understand is how fast the decision happened. There was no internal debate, no weighing of options, no rational analysis of whether this was safe or wise or remotely within the scope of anything my training had prepared me for. A child was dying. That was the only fact that existed. It turned immediately when I spoke. Another deliberate, non-threatening movement, angled so it could see me in its peripheral vision as it moved, never fully turning its back to me. And it led me off the trail into the forest to the east, not crashing through the undergrowth, moving with a fluid, purposeful efficiency that covered ground faster than I expected and left almost no broken vegetation. I was following a large, highly intelligent being through dense forest at a pace that required my full athletic capacity to maintain, and it was continuously calibrating its speed to ensure I didn't fall behind. That calibration, that continuous visible adjustment of pace to account for my limitations, was the second thing that destroyed any residual doubt I might have held about what I was dealing with. Animals do not do that. Predators do not do that. Only beings with genuine theory of mind, beings capable of modeling another creature's perspective and needs and then acting on that model, do that. We moved northeast through the forest for approximately 20 minutes. I had my compass. I noted landmarks. The search and rescue training was running underneath everything, automatic and silent, keeping track of where I was even as the rest of me was functioning in a state of suspended astonishment. At approximately 6:11 a.m., we reached a shallow rocky depression, perhaps 30 meters across, screened on all sides by dense fir. And there, in the center of that depression, I saw what had driven it to a human being in desperation. I'm going to be careful with this section, not because the details are uncertain. They are etched into me with a permanence that I have come to understand as the way the mind treats experiences it cannot process through normal channels. But because what I witnessed in that depression was something deeply private, a family in crisis. And even now, with 20 years of distance, I feel the weight of being an outsider to something that was not meant for human eyes. There were 3 others in the depression, 2 adults. I understood immediately from their positioning, from the way they oriented to the being who had led me here, that one was a partner and one was somehow an elder. The elder was the largest, considerably taller and broader than the one who had found me, with gray streaked hair and a stillness that suggested enormous age. The partner was smaller and crouched over a 4th figure, the child, in a posture of such concentrated, focused anxiety that it took my breath away, because it was precisely the posture of a parent kneeling over a sick child. No translation required. The child was perhaps 4 feet tall, young by any reckoning, and it was clearly in severe distress. Its breathing was visible from where I stood, rapid, shallow, labored. It was conscious, but barely. Its eyes, when they opened briefly, were glazed with fever. My observations consistently showed in that moment and in the frantic assessment that followed that this family had done everything within their capacity before coming to me. The child was positioned carefully, sheltered from wind. Leaves of specific plants, I would identify them later as Oregon grape and yarrow, had been layered beneath it in a way that suggested deliberate medicinal application. They had tried their own remedies. Those remedies had not been enough. The being who had led me to this place stood at my side. "She cannot breathe properly," it said. "This began 3 days ago. It is getting worse. We do not know what this is. You know medicines. Your kind knows this thing." The assumption that because I was human, I would have medical knowledge beyond what they possessed was both touching and devastating. I was a trail worker. I had wilderness first aid certification. I was not a doctor. I was not even close to a doctor. And I was standing in a hidden depression in the Wenatchee National Forest, being asked to save a child with the contents of my day pack and whatever I could remember from a 3-day first aid refresher course. I knelt beside the child. I began to assess. The assessment took about 8 minutes, and I want to be precise about what I found because it is relevant to everything that followed. The child's temperature, checked against my own forearm, I had no thermometer, was alarming. The skin was hot enough that the difference was instantly perceptible. The breathing was the primary concern. I could hear, when I leaned close, a wet, crackling quality in the lungs that I recognized from wilderness first aid training as potentially indicating fluid accumulation. Pneumonia was my best guess, a severe respiratory infection of some kind. There was nothing in my day pack that could treat pneumonia. I had ibuprofen, which could bring down fever. I had a water filter and a hydration bladder. I had an emergency blanket. I had trail snacks. I had the contents of a standard wilderness day pack carried by a trail maintenance worker on a routine morning inspection. I gave the child ibuprofen, 2 tablets dissolved in water, administered slowly. The partner helped with this, supporting the child's head with enormous, impossibly gentle hands. The being who had found me watched everything I did with a focused intensity that I can only compare to the way a very intelligent student watches a demonstration of something critical. Here's where the situation became more complicated. "Is there more?" it asked. "A stronger medicine?" I told it the truth, that what I had was for fever, not for what was in her lungs, that what she likely needed was an antibiotic, a specific human medicine that I did not have and could not obtain in the forest, that to get what she actually needed, I would have to leave, drive to a town, and bring it back. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. The elder, who had not moved or spoken, turned its head and looked at me for the first time. The look was evaluative in a way that I felt physically, a measuring, weighing assessment of my trustworthiness that was more thorough and more penetrating than any job interview I have ever sat through. I did not look away. I'm not sure I could have. The being who had brought me said, finally, "Will you come back?" I said yes. "How do we know this?" the elder said. Its voice was even deeper than the first being's, and its English was slightly different, more formal, more archaic in its construction, as if it had learned from an older source. I said, "You don't. You have to decide whether to trust me." Another long silence. Then the elder made a sound, not English, not a word I recognized, and the being beside me said, "Go. Come back before the sun is at the top of the sky." I had 4 hours. I will tell you exactly what I did and exactly what I considered, because both matter. I got back to my truck at approximately 7:20 a.m. The drive to the nearest town with a pharmacy, Entiat, population under 1,000, was 40 minutes. I sat in my truck for 3 minutes before starting it, because I had to decide something important. I could call this in. I could pick up the radio, contact the Forest Service, contact Search and Rescue, and report that I had found a family of Bigfoot in the Wenatchee National Forest with a sick child. I sat with that option for those 3 full minutes, and I examined it from every angle. And what I concluded, and I stand by this conclusion 20 years later, is that reporting would not have helped the child. Reporting would have brought helicopters and officials and researchers and photographers, and it would have brought all of them before I could return with what the child actually needed. And in the chaos and the exposure and the panic that would have followed for that family, the child would have died. And even if she hadn't died immediately, even in the best case, what followed for that family and their kind would have been something I was not willing to set in motion. My experience revealed something profound in those 3 minutes. That the decision to help someone genuinely, rather than the decision to report that you are helping someone, are not always the same decision. Sometimes they are directly opposed. I drove to Entiat. I went to the pharmacy. I told the pharmacist that I had a child with what I believed was a severe respiratory infection and asked what over-the-counter options were available for someone who couldn't reach a doctor immediately. She was a practical woman. This is rural Washington State, not a place where people ask many questions. And she helped me put together the best available combination: a pediatric fever reducer, an expectorant, an antibiotic adjacent supplement, and saline solution for the breathing. I spent $47.83. I remember the exact amount because I wrote it in my field notebook on the drive back, along with dosage notes the pharmacist had written on a card. I was back at my truck's trailhead parking area by 9:15 a.m. I ran most of the way back. The elder was at the edge of the depression when I arrived, standing at the perimeter as if it had positioned itself there to intercept me before I reached the others. A sentry posture, I understood, that would have allowed it to stop me if something in my return had indicated bad faith. The fact that it stepped aside when I arrived told me more about their capacity for reading intention than I could have learned any other way. The child was worse. The breathing was more labored than when I had left. The partner hadn't moved from its position beside her. The being who had found me, I had started to think of it privately as the father, though I had no confirmation of that structure, was pacing the perimeter of the depression in a way that looked like barely controlled panic filtered through an enormous physical discipline, like a very large, very strong person who has decided that panic is not useful and is containing it by force of will. I knelt beside the child and began. The fever reducer first, then the expectorant, dissolved carefully in water. I talked through everything I was doing, not for my own benefit, but because I had the instinct, which proved correct, that they would want to understand what was being administered and why. The father crouched beside me while I worked, watching my hands with that same focused, learning attention I had noted earlier. "What is this?" he asked of each thing I gave her. I explained as clearly as I could. Not the chemistry. I didn't know the chemistry. The function. What each thing was trying to do in her body. He listened without interruption, and I had the distinct sense that he was memorizing everything. By 10:40 a.m., the child's breathing had eased slightly, not dramatically, but measurably. The crackling quality was still there, but the rate had slowed from its frantic pace, and her color, which I had noted as gray-tinged when I arrived, had shifted toward something closer to normal. The elder, who had moved back into the depression after I returned, said something in their language. The father responded. A brief exchange that I could not follow, but whose emotional content I could read. Something between relief and continued fear, which is the particular emotional state of parents whose child has pulled back from an edge but not yet reached safety. I told them that what she had was likely treatable, but that it would take more than one dose, more than one day. That she needed consistent treatment over several days, ideally with actual antibiotics that I couldn't provide without a prescription. That I could return the following morning with more of what I had brought today. The father looked at me for a long moment. "You would come back again," he said. It wasn't quite a question. I said yes. "Why?" the elder asked. I said, "Because she's sick and I can help." The elder was quiet. Then, "This is not a common answer among your kind." I returned every morning for 5 consecutive days, August 4th through August 8th, 2004. Each morning before dawn, each time with whatever I had been able to gather the previous afternoon, more fever reducer, more expectorant. On the third day, a prescription amoxicillin that I had managed to obtain by describing the symptoms to a physician's assistant in Chilean who had known me for years and trusted my assessment. This creature holds a secret that I am still turning over, because those 5 mornings taught me more about a non-human intelligence than I could have learned from any other method, and what I learned was not what I expected. I expected gratitude in some form. What I found was something more interesting and ultimately more valuable. I found a family functioning, working through a crisis with the full complement of emotional, practical, and social responses that any family in a crisis brings to bear. There was parental anxiety and elder counsel and disagreement between the father and the elder about how much exposure to allow me, and a kind of sibling curiosity from a second young one, slightly older than the sick child, perhaps 6 feet tall, who watched me from a careful distance each morning with an intelligence and a wariness that reminded me of nothing so much as a teenager deciding whether an adult has earned their trust. By the 3rd morning, the child was sitting up. By the 4th, she was moving slowly around the perimeter of the depression. By the 5th, she looked at me directly for the first time. Her eyes were amber, different from her father's dark brown, and they held in that first direct look a quality that I have never been able to fully articulate. Not innocence exactly. She had been close to death 4 days before, and something of that is never entirely absent from the face afterward. Not quite wariness. Something more like the look of a being who has had an experience that has revised its understanding of the world and who is deciding how to incorporate the revision. She said something to her father in their language, he answered. She looked at me again. She asks what you are called, the father said. I told her my name, Marcus. She repeated it carefully, Marcus, with a precision that made me understand the family's linguistic capacity wasn't unique to the adults. It was native to their species. My observations consistently showed across those 5 days that once the elder had accepted my presence, a process that seemed to complete itself between the 2nd and 3rd morning, marked by the elder making direct eye contact with me for the first time and dipping its enormous head in what I could only interpret as acknowledgement. The father became willing to talk, not constantly, not freely, but in the spare, careful way of someone sharing selectively rather than holding back entirely. He answered questions when I asked them in the right way. Specific, quiet, genuinely curious rather than extractive. He volunteered information when something I did or said seemed to prompt it, and what he shared across those 5 mornings, broken into fragments between the work of caring for the child, assembled itself into a picture I have spent 20 years trying to hold in my mind without distortion. They were not solitary creatures. This I had suspected from the presence of the elder. He confirmed it. They maintained what he called in his precise, slightly formal English, extended families across territories. Not packs, not troops. Families with the full social complexity that word implies, the obligations and tensions and hierarchies and affections. They had, he told me, strict protocols about human contact. The decision to approach me had required the elder's consent, and the elder had given it only after argument. The argument being, as best I could understand from his account, between the pragmatic necessity of the child's survival and the enormous risk that any human contact represented. If you had told others, he said on the second morning, we would have had to leave, even with her sick, even that. They knew what human attention meant. They had, across however many generations, developed a clear-eyed understanding of what happened to wild things when humans decided to study them. On the fourth morning, he told me something that I have thought about nearly every day since. I had asked, carefully, not wanting to overstep, what they thought of humans generally. He was quiet for a long time. Then, your kind has two natures, the nature that helps and the nature that takes. We have watched both for a long time. We stay away because we cannot tell quickly enough which nature we are meeting. You showed us quickly. This is rare. On the morning of August 8th, when I arrived at the depression, the child was on her feet and the elder was sitting, which I had never seen it do, in my presence. A posture that communicated somehow that the emergency was over, that the register had shifted from crisis to something approaching ordinary. The child's breathing was clear. Her color was good. She moved around the space with a tentative, recovering energy that looked achingly like any child on the far side of a bad illness. Careful with itself, occasionally stopping to check in with its own body, but fundamentally okay. The father told me they would move on. That staying in one location for this long was already outside their usual patterns, that the deviation had been noted and they needed to correct it. He said this without apology and without elaboration, and I understood that he was not being cold. He was being honest, in the direct way of someone who does not use softening language about the reality of their situation. I said I was glad she was going to be okay. He said, we will not forget this. The elder, who had been sitting with its eyes closed in what I had decided was the equivalent of contemplative rest, opened its eyes and looked at me. When it spoke, it was the longest thing it had said directly to me across all 5 mornings. You came back, it said. You did not tell. You brought what was needed, and you asked nothing. It paused. Most of your kind helps because it wants something in return. You helped because the child was sick. This is an old way of being. Your kind has mostly forgotten it. Do not let yourself forget it. I didn't speak. I didn't trust myself to speak. The elder dipped its head, the same gesture it had given me on the 3rd morning, but deeper this time, held longer. Then it stood, and in the way of a very old, very large being that has conserved energy for decades, it simply became part of the forest. There and then, not there. The father looked at me one last time. The child looked at me. She said my name, Marcus, and then her father guided her gently toward the trees, and within moments they were gone with the same fluid, total completeness that I had by now come to understand as the defining physical characteristic of their kind, not hidden, not fleeing, received by the forest the way the forest receives rain. I stood alone in the depression for 20 minutes. Then I walked back to the trail. Here is where I have to be careful about how I use the word shocking, because the shocks that followed the encounter were not what you might expect. They were not dramatic. They were not the stuff of thriller plots. They were quieter than that, and in their quietness, more destabilizing. The first shock came approximately 10 days later, on August 18th, 2004. I was driving the same forest road toward a trailhead I was scheduled to inspect, and I saw a truck parked on the shoulder with two men and expensive camera equipment and the kind of eager, anticipatory energy that I had come to recognize in my years working the forest as belonging to people who had come to look for something specific. I stopped and asked what they were up to. They told me they were researchers, Bigfoot researchers, who had received a tip that there had been unusual activity in the upper Entiate drainage. My blood went cold. I asked who the tip had come from. They mentioned a name I didn't recognize, someone who had apparently been in the area around August 3rd and had noted what they described as large anomalous tracks near the trailhead where I had parked that morning. Someone had seen the tracks, not the family, not the depression, just tracks at the trailhead, from when the father had walked up the trail to find me. I told the researchers I worked that drainage regularly and had nothing unusual to report. I kept my voice neutral. I have been in search and rescue long enough to know how to manage my own affect in high-stakes conversations. They moved on 2 days later, but it was a shock because it illustrated with visceral clarity exactly what the elder had described, how fast human attention moves once triggered and how little buffer exists between a family living in deliberate invisibility and a world that would very much like to make them visible. In February of 2005, I was assigned to assess storm damage in a section of forest adjacent to where the depression had been. I went, partly out of duty and partly, I will be honest, out of the quiet hope of some sign that they were still in the area. The depression was empty. I expected that. What I did not expect was what I found at its center. 3 smooth river stones stacked precisely on top of each other in a cairn no higher than my knee. I stood looking at it for a long time. The forest was winter quiet around me, the kind of deep February silence that feels like the landscape holding its breath. Those 3 stones had not been there in the configuration I found them. I was certain of that. The stones were river smooth, in a location far from any river. They had been brought there and placed there deliberately, in the particular configuration of a message rather than a coincidence. We were here. We remember. We are still. I did not touch them. I photographed them. I walked back to my truck. I sat in the parking area for a while, watching the snow fall on the windshield, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. A sense of being part of something larger than my own life, connected to a story whose dimensions I could not fully see. That feeling has not entirely left me in the 20 years since. My experience revealed something profound about the nature of life-altering knowledge. It is not free. It reshapes you in ways you do not choose and cannot fully control. And the reshaping costs things that you valued. What I lost in the years following that August was the comfort of skepticism. I had organized much of my inner life around the reliable solidity of the empirical. If I could not measure it, document it, verify it through standard means, it did not require my serious attention. That framework collapsed on August 3rd, 2004, and I have never been able to reconstruct it because the experience I had does not fit inside it. I became, in ways I struggled to articulate and mostly didn't try to, a person who understood that the world was larger and more inhabited and more alive than my prior framework had accommodated. This is not a comfortable thing to become. It changes your relationship to news about deforestation, about wilderness preservation, about the casual way our civilization treats the spaces it has not yet colonized. It changes the way you walk in a forest, the quality of attention you bring, the feeling that you are alone when you are not, have never been actually alone. I lost 2 close friendships in the years after 2004, not because I told anyone what had happened. I did not. But because the experience had changed the kind of person I was in, ways that showed up in how I moved through the world, and the men I had been close to found the change without knowing its source, alienating. I was quieter. I was more attentive to things they couldn't see and didn't feel the need to see. I was less interested in the conversations we used to have and more interested in spending time in the forest with my mouth shut and my ears open. I do not regret any of it. The elder told me not to forget an old way of being, and I have not forgotten it. But I want to be honest that carrying this changed me, and that the changing was not painless. In the summer of 2019, a wildfire burned through a significant portion of the Entiat drainage. I watched the smoke column from my cabin for 3 days. I thought about the depression, about the 3 smooth stones, about a family that navigated their world through the living network of a forest that was now burning. I do not know if they are still in that area. I do not know if the stones survived. I know that they were built to move, that their deliberate invisibility is also a form of resilience, and I have to trust that the elder's wisdom extended to knowing when to go. What most people don't understand is that the story of that August was not at its heart a story about Bigfoot. It was a story about what happens when desperation strips away all the careful management of distance between 2 kinds of beings, and what turns out to be possible in the space that opens up. A father who exhausted every other option and then asked a stranger for help. A stranger who chose to help rather than report. A child who recovered and looked at me with amber eyes and said my name. The elder told me that most people help because they want something in return. I have thought about this for 20 years. I think it is true, and I think it is the hinge on which most human relationships with each other, with the natural world, with the things we do not yet fully understand, turn. We help to feel virtuous. We help to feel powerful. We help to earn reciprocity. These are not entirely bad reasons to help, but they are not the only reasons available, and they are not sufficient for the situations where the stakes are highest. The only currency the Father had to offer me was trust. He offered it because he had no choice. I accepted it because the child was sick and I could help. That exchange, stripped of all other motivations, was the purest transaction I have ever been part of. And it is the one I return to when I am trying to understand what I believe about what we owe to the living world and the beings, seen and unseen, known and unknown, that inhabit it alongside us. I am telling this story now for one reason. I believe that the world is full of moments that ask us which nature we will show up with. The nature that helps, or the nature that takes. The nature that sees vulnerability and moves toward it, or the nature that sees vulnerability and reaches for a camera or a radio. I was asked on a quiet morning in August 2004 which nature I would show up with. I happened to show up with the right one. I don't know that I would have on a different morning, in a different frame of mind. I don't know that I would have if I had been more frightened or more ambitious or less lonely in a way that made the connection feel valuable regardless of its source. What I know is that a child is alive because a being that had every reason to distrust me chose to trust me, and because I chose to be worthy of that trust. And I know that in the 20 years since, when I have been in the forest and the quality of silence changes in that particular way, when the birds stop and the weight of an intentional presence settles over the trees, I do not move, I do not reach for anything. I simply sit, and I let whatever is there know, in whatever way it is capable of perceiving, that I am the same man I was on August 3rd, 2004. That I am still holding what was asked of me, that I have not forgotten. The elder said it to me on the last morning, and I will close with it, because it is the best thing I have ever been told and the hardest thing I have ever tried to live by. Do not let yourself forget the old way of being. I am 58 years old. I go to the forest as often as my knees will allow. I sit with the old trees. I keep my mouth shut and my ears open. And I try every single day not to forget. If there is anything I can give you from what happened to me, it is this. When something asks you for help, something wild, something you don't understand, something that does not fit inside your existing framework for what the world is, pay attention to which nature you're about to show up with. You will live with the answer for the rest of your life. Make sure you can.